A single note can end a lifetime of lies. The chandelier above shimmered like frozen stars as Lucy wiped the last glass at Le Muriel, the kind of restaurant where linen napkins were folded like origami and secrets whispered louder than music. She'd worked there for 9 years, long enough to know that wealth always came with a smell: money, perfume, and something colder. Tonight, she served table 12. At that table sat Grant Ashford, the man whose face filled magazines, and beside him, Evelyn Caldwell, a woman so perfect she looked sculpted. The two were set to marry in less than 24 hours, their $5 million wedding already the talk of Boston. But as Lucy approached with the dessert tray, she wasn't carrying crème brûlée. Between her fingers was a folded piece of ivory paper, edges soft from being read too many times. She stopped at the table. Evelyn's laughter fell silent. Grant looked up, the weight of his name filling the air between them. Lucy's voice was steady, but her heart pressed against her ribs. "Sir," she said quietly, placing the note near his hand, "someone asked me to give this to you. Said you'd understand." The pianist in the corner hit a wrong note. Evelyn's smile thinned. Grant's gaze dropped to the folded paper as though it might burn him. The gold watch on his wrist caught the chandelier's light, the same model her late husband once admired in a newspaper ad decades ago. "Who told you to bring this?" His voice was low, precise, a blade in velvet. Lucy didn't flinch. "A woman who said you once promised her the truth." A hush spread across the room. The waiter polishing silverware stopped mid-motion. Evelyn leaned forward, eyes sharp. "What is that supposed to mean?" Grant didn't answer. He unfolded the note. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Inside was a faded photograph. A woman holding a newborn, the name Grant Ashford Jr., scrawled on the back in the same handwriting that now read, "Before the wedding, remember who you are." Something inside him cracked. He turned the picture over twice, as if it could change. Evelyn reached for his arm, but he pulled away. The man who owned half the skyline suddenly looked small, almost fragile beneath the glow of crystal light. Lucy stood motionless, her apron still damp from the sink, knowing this was the moment the past had been waiting for. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth was already on the table, trembling between the empty wine glasses. Grant's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" Lucy met his eyes, tired eyes, older now, but still searching. "It was left for you," she said, "by the woman who raised me." The chandelier flickered. Evelyn's breath caught. Somewhere in the room, a glass cracked. And in that silence, the empire of appearances began to crumble. Grant left the restaurant in silence, the note folded tight between his fingers, as if the paper itself could anchor his unraveling world. The night outside was sharp and cold, the kind that turned breath into fog and thoughts into ghosts. The city lights shimmered on the wet asphalt, every reflection a version of himself he no longer recognized. He had always believed in control that power, when earned, made a man invincible, yet now one waitress and a slip of paper had undone everything he built. The driver opened the car door, but Grant waved him off and walked instead, his footsteps echoing between marble facades that seemed suddenly hollow. Back at his penthouse, glass walls framed the skyline like a cage made of stars. He dropped the note onto the polished counter, staring at it the way one might study an old wound that never healed. Evelyn's perfume still lingered in his coat. The scent turned sweet to sour in the same breath. He poured a drink he didn't taste, sat down, and unfolded the note again, tracing each word as if reading them differently might change their meaning. "Before the wedding, remember who you are." His mother used to say those exact words before every board meeting, every speech, but she had never told him why. Grant moved to the study, where photographs of his father hung like warnings, smiling beside senators, shaking hands with presidents, always immaculate, always watching. He pulled a small key from the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he hadn't touched in years, and unlocked the old safe built into the wall. Inside lay a single leather-bound album wrapped in yellowed parchment. He hadn't opened it since his father's funeral. As he turned the pages, time folded inward. photographs of lavish galas, ribbon cuttings, and black-tie dinners where everyone smiled too perfectly. But near the end, pressed between two pages, was a torn photograph of a woman, brown hair, gentle eyes, wearing the same pendant that hung around the waitress's neck tonight. The room seemed to tilt. Grant sank into the chair, heart pounding as memories sharpened. He had seen that face before, blurred in the corners of his childhood, a woman who used to hum lullabies outside his room when his mother was away. Her name surfaced like a half-remembered dream. Helen. She had disappeared when he was 8. His father told him she moved overseas. Now he wasn't sure she ever left. Grant scrolled through old digital records, hands trembling slightly, searching archives under his father's name. In a hidden folder labeled Caldwell Holdings, he found a scanned document dated 30 years ago, a trust agreement transferring property to a woman named Helen Ward. The beneficiary line caught his breath. And her daughter, Lucy Ward. The glass of scotch slipped from his hand, shattering across the floor. He rose abruptly, pacing, the walls closing in. Outside, lightning flickered faintly over the harbor, illuminating the reflection of a man stripped of his armor. The words repeated in his mind like a curse. By the woman who raised me. Could it be true? If Helen Ward was Lucy's mother and his father's beneficiary, then Lucy, he swallowed hard, unwilling to finish the thought. Sleep refused him. At dawn, Grant drove without destination, guided only by memory. The road led him to an old nursing home on the outskirts of Cambridge, a place his family once donated to, a name listed on every holiday charity card. He walked through the hall that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fading lavender until a nurse recognized the surname and led him to room 214. Inside, an elderly man sat by the window, oxygen tube at his nose, flipping through a Bible that looked older than him. "You're Henry Lowe," Grant said quietly. "My father's driver." The old man's hands trembled, then stilled. "I knew you'd come eventually," he rasped. "She said you would." Grant stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Helen Ward, tell me what happened." Henry smiled weakly, eyes glassy with the weight of decades. "Your father loved her, in his way. But love doesn't last in houses built on power. When she had the child, they made her disappear. Money bought silence. Guilt built empires." He coughed, then added, "She didn't want revenge, only truth." Grant's pulse roared in his ears. The nurse adjusted the oxygen line, but he barely noticed. "The girl, Lucy Ward," he said slowly, tasting the name like confession. "She's?" Henry nodded once. "She's the one he left behind, and now she's the one who found you." The world narrowed to the hum of machines, the soft rattle of rain against glass. Grant stood unmoving, every certainty collapsing beneath the weight of revelation. The note hadn't been a threat. It was a message from the past, a mirror held to everything he had forgotten. Outside, dawn bled across the skyline, thin and colorless. He walked out into the rain, no umbrella, no destination, the city around him awake and unaware. Somewhere, a wedding planner was arranging flowers worth more than a family's yearly wage. Somewhere, Evelyn was choosing a dress she would never wear. And Grant Ashford, heir to a dynasty built on secrets, was finally learning the cost of truth. Rain fell harder that evening, turning the city into a blur of glass and reflection as Grant drove aimlessly through the streets, haunted by the truth clawing at the edges of his mind. Every traffic light seemed to last an eternity, every face on the sidewalk a ghost of someone he had failed to see before. The note lay open on the passenger seat, the ink slightly smudged by water, but the message still clear enough to cut. "Before the wedding, remember who you are." The words didn't feel like an accusation anymore. They felt like a plea. By the time he reached the family estate in Beacon Hill, night had descended fully, swallowing the marble gates and manicured lawns into shadow. The mansion loomed like a monument to everything he once believed about legacy, its chandeliers glowing faintly behind tall windows, unaware that its foundation had already begun to rot. Inside, portraits of his ancestors lined the corridor, every oil-painted eye following his movements with silent judgment. The scent of old mahogany and expensive polish clung to the air, the kind of sterile perfection that never allowed for truth. Grant went straight to his father's study, a place sealed after the funeral, untouched since. Dust floated through the lamplight as he turned the key and pushed the heavy door open. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and forgotten power. Papers still lay scattered on the desk as though the man had just stepped out for a moment. On the center blotter sat a wooden box, one he had seen countless times as a boy, always off limits, always locked. Now, the lock clicked open beneath his shaking fingers. Inside were letters bound with a ribbon the color of wine, each one addressed in the same looping handwriting he had seen on the photograph. Helen Ward. The first letter began, "I was wrong to hide you. The world will not forgive a truth born out of shame." Grant's breath caught as he read, each sentence another brick collapsing from the wall of his upbringing. His father had written dozens of letters, never sent, filled with apologies and fragmented memories of a life he had chosen to erase. He sank into the leather chair, running a hand through his hair as if to steady himself. The rain tapped against the windows in steady rhythm, like a clock marking the seconds before collapse. A sound behind him made him turn the faint creak of the door, the shuffle of careful footsteps. It was Evelyn, her red dress damp at the hem, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. "Where have you been?" she asked, voice low but trembling. "The rehearsal dinner is over. The press is calling, and you're here digging through tombs." Grant stood slowly, the letter still in his hand. "You knew," he said, not accusing, just stating the inevitable. Her silence confirmed it. He took a step closer. "You knew about her, about the child, about the money that bought silence." Evelyn looked away, arms crossing tightly over her chest. "Your father told me. He said it was handled, that the girl would never surface. You weren't supposed to know." He let out a laugh that sounded nothing like humor. "Handled? That's what you call erasing a family?" The chandelier above flickered as thunder rolled outside, and for the first time Evelyn's poise cracked. "You're throwing everything away over a waitress," she spat. "Over some ghost of your father's mistake." "She's not a mistake," Grant said softly. "She's the truth he buried. The truth I've been living on top of like a man walking on glass." Evelyn moved closer, her tone shifting from anger to calculation. "Think about what you're doing. Tomorrow isn't just a wedding, Grant. It's a merger, a dynasty. My father's investment, your board's trust, your image, everything collapses if you walk away." But the words no longer carried weight. He could see now how his entire life had been constructed from half-truths, polished smiles, and contracts inked with other people's suffering. He looked at her, at the cold precision of her beauty, and realized he had never really seen her before. "If the cost of keeping power is becoming my father," he said quietly, "then I'd rather lose it all." She stepped back, stunned by the calm in his voice. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but the words barely reached him. He turned away, placing the letter gently back into the box and closing it. "Maybe," he said, "but at least I'll know who I am." Grant left her standing there amid the relics of a dying empire, her reflection fractured in the glass cabinet beside her. He walked down the corridor lined with portraits, their painted eyes now seeming to avert their gaze, as if ashamed. Outside, the rain softened into mist. He stood beneath it, breathing the cold night air, like someone tasting freedom for the first time. When he reached his car, he looked once more at the note resting on the passenger seat. The edges curled now, fragile yet unbroken. He thought of Lucy, the stillness in her voice, the sadness in her eyes, the courage it took to deliver the truth, knowing what it might cost. Somewhere out there, she was probably back at that same restaurant, washing dishes, unaware that her world had just collided with his in ways neither could undo. Grant started the engine, but instead of driving home, he turned toward the waterfront, where dawn would soon rise over the Atlantic. He didn't know what he would say when he saw her again, or how to mend the years that had been stolen from both of them. All he knew was that the wedding would never happen, not after what he had learned, not after realizing that love built on lies was no love at all. As the city lights faded behind him, and the horizon began to pale, Grant whispered into the quiet car, more to himself than to anyone listening. Some promises are meant to be broken so the truth can finally breathe. Oh, morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of light that makes every reflection look uncertain, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Lucy stood by the restaurant's back entrance, apron folded in her hands, watching the drizzle gather on the pavement. Her shift was over, yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. Rumors were already spreading, something about a billionaire's wedding called off at the last moment, a bride vanishing from the ceremony, headlines bursting across every screen. She didn't need to see the name to know. The city hummed with it. The truth she had carried in her pocket had finally escaped into the open air. Inside, the clatter of breakfast prep began. The scent of coffee and toasted bread filled the space, yet everything felt wrong, quieter somehow, as if the building itself understood what had changed. Lucy poured herself a cup of coffee and sat near the window where rain streaked the glass in slow silver lines. She traced one drop with her fingertip, thinking of her mother's voice the night before she died. Soft, breathless, a whisper that had lingered for decades. "Promise me," Helen had said, "that one day he'll know." Lucy had kept that promise, but now the silence that followed felt heavier than the secret itself. The doorbell chimed. It wasn't a customer too early for that. She turned and froze. Grant Ashford stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and exhausted, his expensive suit wrinkled, tie loose, the kind of man who looked like he hadn't slept or spoken in hours. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lucy rose slowly, the sound of her chair scraping across the tile echoing like a memory. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, though her voice carried a tremor of disbelief. Grant stepped closer, water dripping from his coat, his expression unreadable. "I had to come," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with something that wasn't regret, but something close to it. "The wedding's off." She nodded once, eyes lowering to the note that had started it all, now lying folded on the counter beside the register. "I saw," she whispered. "The whole city saw." For a moment, the world shrank to the space between them, the smell of wet wool, the ticking of the wall clock, the soft hiss of rain. Grant's gaze drifted to the pendant around her neck, the tiny silver locket shaped like a teardrop. "Your mother," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "She worked for my family." Lucy met his eyes, and for the first time he didn't look like a man used to being obeyed. He looked human, wounded, uncertain, smaller somehow beneath the weight of truth. "She didn't want revenge," Lucy said. "She just wanted you to know what was real." Grant nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "She was right. I've lived my entire life surrounded by lies dressed as loyalty, and I let them define me." His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it on the counter between them, the gesture careful, reverent. "This belonged to her," he said. "I found it in my father's study. Inside the locket is a photograph, half of it missing. The other half is here." He opened the box. Inside lay a folded picture, faded and fragile. Helen holding a child in her arms, only part of the baby's face visible. Lucy touched the edge of the photo, her breath catching as she realized what it meant. "She kept the other half," Lucy whispered. "It was tucked inside the lining of her coat. I thought it was nothing but an old keepsake." Grant's eyes softened, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting his lips. "It wasn't nothing," he said. "It was proof that what they buried was still alive." The coffee machine clicked behind them, breaking the silence. Lucy poured 2 cups and slid one across the counter. "You look like you need this," she murmured. He took it, hands brushing hers briefly, a fleeting spark that neither acknowledged but both felt. They stood there, sipping coffee like 2 strangers who had been waiting a lifetime to meet. After a long pause, Grant spoke again, his tone quieter, steadier. "I don't know what comes next. The company, the board, the press, they'll devour this story before I even take my next breath. But I couldn't let their version be the only one that exists." He met her gaze fully now, his voice lowering. "I wanted to tell you that I'm not my father, and I won't repeat his silence." "Oh." Lucy looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Then start by not running from the truth anymore." He smiled faintly, a weary, broken thing that somehow still carried hope. "I suppose that's what I'm trying to do." He reached into his pocket again, pulling out a plain envelope this time. "This is for you. It's not money. It's everything I found, letters, documents, proof of who you are. If you ever want the world to know, it's your choice, not mine." She took the envelope, feeling its weight heavier than paper, lighter than vengeance. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the world doesn't need to know. You do." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and still. Grant set his cup down, hesitated, then reached for her hand. "Your mother saved me from a lie," he said quietly. "You saved me from living it. All." For the first time in years, Lucy felt something shift inside her, a loosening she hadn't realized she needed. She squeezed his hand once before pulling away. "Go home, Grant. Start over." That's what she wanted. He nodded, eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned toward the door. The bell chimed softly as he stepped into the pale morning light. Lucy watched him walk down the street until the crowd swallowed him whole, then looked at the note still lying on the counter, its edges curling, the ink faded but the truth intact. She smiled faintly and whispered to no one, "She'd be proud of us." As the sun broke through the clouds, its light spread across the window, catching the reflection of the photograph still open on the counter, two halves finally whole, framed by the golden morning, and a silence that no longer hurt. The following week arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that seeps through every conversation and lingers even when the city refuses to slow down. Grant stayed away from the office, ignoring the calls from his board, the reporters waiting outside his building, and the endless messages from people who wanted to know why a man like him would throw away everything over a folded note and a forgotten woman's name. He no longer felt the need to explain himself. Truth had its own gravity, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting against it. The newspapers had done their job. Billionaire heir cancels $5M wedding family secrets emerge. Each headline told a slightly different version of his story, but none of them came close to the truth. In the quiet hours of the morning, he would sit by the window of his penthouse and watch the harbor fog roll in, letting the world spin without him. The mansion, the money, the dynasty, all of it seemed like artifacts of a person he no longer wanted to be. He hadn't seen Lucy since that morning at the restaurant, though her voice still echoed in his mind with an odd tenderness. "Go home, Grant. Start over." He tried. He started walking instead of being driven, started cooking simple meals instead of ordering from chefs, started answering his own phone. The silence of solitude was uncomfortable at first, but it was an honest discomfort, one that didn't demand performance. And yet, beneath that quiet, a deeper tension brewed, something colder, sharper, growing louder each day. The shareholders were restless, the Caldwell family was furious, and Evelyn's father, Charles Caldwell, was a man who didn't forgive humiliation easily. Grant knew the confrontation would come. Power never relinquishes its grip without a fight. It arrived one evening in the form of a private summons to the boardroom of Ashford Technologies, the company his father had built and he had inherited. The meeting was framed as a strategic review, but everyone understood it was an ambush. The conference room was all glass and chrome, reflecting the city skyline like a second layer of judgment. Seated across from him was Charles Caldwell, impeccably dressed, his expression calm, but his eyes gleaming with a controlled kind of rage. "You've jeopardized everything," Charles began, his tone smooth as silk but heavy as iron. "You embarrassed my daughter, my family, and your investors. Do you have any idea what that costs?" Grant leaned back in his chair, fingers laced, voice steady but quiet. "I do, but some costs are worth paying." Charles smiled without warmth. "You think this is about your moral epiphany? It's about control. You had it and now you've lost it. Your company will follow." "Oh." Around the table, board members shifted uneasily. Grant recognized the pattern, the way fear moved through powerful men like a silent contagion. They wanted stability, not conscience. "You can have the company," he said finally, surprising even himself. "If keeping it means burying the truth again, then it's not mine anymore." The words fell like stones into water. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Charles rose slowly, collecting his briefcase, his voice cutting through the silence. "You think walking away makes you righteous, but you'll realize soon enough that guilt doesn't feed you and integrity doesn't keep the lights on." Grant stood too, meeting his gaze evenly. Maybe not. But lies burn everything they touch. He walked out before anyone could answer, leaving behind a table full of men who couldn't decide whether to admire or despise him. Outside, the city's air felt colder, cleaner somehow. He walked aimlessly until his phone buzzed a number he didn't recognize. The message was simple. "She's here. Room 17, St. Jude's Hospital." Lucy hadn't told him about her mother's illness returning, but he understood instantly. Without hesitation, he hailed a cab and rode through the rain-soaked streets until the hospital's neon sign appeared through the fog. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and muted sorrow. He found Lucy sitting alone by a window, her hands clasped, her eyes red but dry. She looked up when he approached, offering a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She's gone," Lucy said quietly. "They called me an hour ago. Peaceful, they said." Grant sat beside her, unsure if words could do anything but harm. "I'm sorry," he murmured. She shook her head. "Don't be. She held on long enough to know you found the truth. That was all she ever wanted." The silence that followed was deep but gentle, the kind that connects instead of divides. Through the window, dawn began to break, soft light spilling over the city like forgiveness. Grant reached into his coat and pulled out a small sealed envelope, the same one she had left unopened before. "There's something else," he said. "Your mother's letter, the one she wrote before she died. I found it in the old box." Lucy hesitated, then took it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The handwriting was faint, but still graceful. She read silently for a long time, tears sliding down her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "She forgave him," she said. "After everything. She forgave my father." Grant looked at her, uncertain whether she meant her father or his, but it didn't matter. Forgiveness blurred such distinctions. "Maybe she knew hate only builds more cages," he said softly. Lucy folded the letter carefully and placed it against her chest. "Maybe," she agreed, "but forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just stops it from owning you." They sat there until the morning light turned gold. Somewhere below, the city woke, engines humming, horns echoing across wet streets. Life, unbothered by their revelations, kept moving. When Lucy finally stood, she turned to him with a look that carried both grief and peace. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You did what she asked. That's enough." Grant nodded, but he knew it wasn't. Some truths demand more than acknowledgement. They demand rebuilding. As she walked away down the hall, he whispered the words that had followed him for days. "A promise means nothing unless it's kept." Outside, the sun climbed higher, scattering the mist into threads of light that touched the hospital windows like quiet benediction. The world, though bruised by what had been revealed, felt a little more honest than it had before. And for the first time in his life, Grant Ashford understood that redemption wasn't found in wealth or power, but in the fragile, unguarded moments when a man chooses to face the truth and keep his word. The morning after the funeral was windless and gray, the sky the color of wet concrete, the kind that pressed low enough to make breathing feel like effort. Grant stood on the small hill overlooking the cemetery, his coat whipping gently in the coastal wind, the scent of salt and soil clinging to everything. The grave beneath him was marked by a simple white stone, Helen Ward, beloved mother, keeper of truth. No grand inscriptions, no marble angels, just quiet honesty carved into stone. Lucy stood a few steps away, holding a single lily in her hand, her hair pulled back, her eyes red but unbroken. Neither spoke for a long time because grief, when shared, needed no language. When she finally stepped forward and laid the flower down, her voice came softly through the wind. She never wanted a grand goodbye, she said, her gaze steady on the grave. She just wanted peace. Grant nodded, the words catching somewhere in his chest. Then she earned it, he replied, his voice low, almost reverent. She carried truth longer than any of us deserved. Lucy turned slightly toward him, the faintest hint of a smile ghosting across her lips. Truth's heavy, she said quietly, but she taught me how to carry it without letting it crush me. They walked together down the gravel path that curved around the cemetery, the crunch of their shoes the only sound between them. The world felt muted, like a photograph losing color, but there was a kind of relief in that stillness. For the first time, neither of them had to pretend. Grant glanced sideways at her, noticing how the early light caught the silver locket at her throat, the same pendant that had connected all their stories. "You remind me of her," he said after a while. "Not because you look like her, but because you don't flinch from the truth." Lucy's answer came soft but certain. "You remind me of him too," she said, "but maybe the man he wanted to be." The wind carried their words away before either could respond. When they reached the gates, Lucy stopped and turned toward him. "What happens now?" she asked, her tone neither hopeful nor afraid. Just curious, the way someone asks about the weather after a long storm. Grant looked at her, then at the city skyline rising beyond the cemetery's edge. "Now," he said slowly, "now we start over, but not separately, I think. Not anymore." For the first time since his world had cracked open, he meant every word. The company was gone. The name Ashford had been stripped from the headlines and replaced by speculation and scandal. Yet standing there beside the woman who had upended everything he once thought sacred, he felt lighter than he had in years. He offered his hand, a quiet invitation, not command. She hesitated only a second before taking it, the warmth of her palm grounding him in the moment. They drove back into the city in silence, each lost in thoughts that didn't need speaking. The streets were slick with rain, the reflections of neon lights turning every puddle into a mirror of what used to be. When they passed the restaurant, Lucy's gaze lingered. "They're hiring a new manager," she murmured. "The owner asked me to take the job." Grant smiled faintly, keeping his eyes on the road. "You should. You've been holding that place together for years." "I might," she said, "but I don't want to be the woman who's always waiting for someone else to decide what comes next." He looked at her then, the quiet steel in her voice anchoring something inside him. "Then don't wait," he said. "Build something new. I'll help if you let me." She turned toward the window, watching the rain smear the city into watercolor. "You already did," she whispered. "You listened." The car rolled to a stop outside a small cafe near the harbor, a place that smelled faintly of roasted beans and sea air. They took a corner table, the same kind of seat where their story had once begun, a table between worlds, between lies and forgiveness. Grant ordered 2 coffees, black, and when the cups arrived, they didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. Every silence between them now felt full, not empty. When he finally broke the quiet, his words were measured. "I'm leaving Boston," he said. "There's a property in Maine, quiet, isolated. I want to rebuild from there. Not another empire, just a life." Lucy nodded, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Maybe that's where peace lives," she said. "Far from noise, far from people who think wealth can buy forgiveness." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Will you visit?" he asked, not pushing, only offering. "Maybe," she replied, meeting his gaze with a calm that could break a man. "But I think your journey's yours to walk first. You can't rebuild anything if you're still carrying guilt like luggage." Her words hit gently but with precision, and Grant found himself nodding. "You sound like her," he said again, the corners of his mouth lifting. Lucy leaned back, studying him. "Maybe we both carry pieces of her," she said. "Maybe that's how the truth survives." Outside, the clouds began to thin, sunlight stretching across the harbor in streaks of gold. The cafe's windows fogged slightly, turning their reflections into ghostly silhouettes that seemed both familiar and new. Grant stood, leaving a few bills on the table. "You'll let me know if you need anything," he said. It wasn't a question. Lucy smiled, this time with warmth. "I think I already have everything I need." As he stepped outside, the wind caught his coat, lifting it slightly, the salt of the sea brushing his face. Behind him, Lucy remained at the window, watching him disappear into the morning crowd. She touched the pendant at her neck and felt, for the first time, that the weight of the past no longer pulled her down, it anchored her. Grant walked toward the pier, each step lighter, the air sharper, his chest expanding as though he were breathing honestly for the first time. The truth hadn't destroyed him, it had simply stripped him bare enough to start again. Somewhere behind him, a waitress and a folded note had rewritten his life, and somewhere ahead, the horizon waited vast, open, unjudging. When he reached the edge of the pier, he looked out at the sea and whispered to the wind, "Some promises keep you alive long after they're broken." The waves answered in their quiet rhythm, steady and endless, carrying the sound away until only the light remained. Grant spent the next few weeks in Maine, where the coastline met the horizon with a silence so vast it almost felt holy. The house he had bought stood at the edge of a small cove, its wooden porch overlooking a stretch of water that glimmered like glass beneath the morning light. The isolation suited him. There were no reporters, no investors, no echoes of the life he had abandoned. Each sunrise arrived soft and colorless. Each night descended with the hum of waves breaking gently against the shore, and slowly he began to breathe in rhythm with it. He spent his days repairing the place, sanding down old window frames, fixing the roof, and repainting the shutters the color of sea foam. Work had always been his language of control, but here it became something else, something that resembled healing. His hands, once accustomed to signing contracts and holding whiskey glasses, now carried the rough honesty of labor. At first, the silence was deafening, but then it started speaking to him in small ways. The creak of the floorboards, the cry of gulls, the wind threading through pine trees. Every evening he'd walk along the beach, collecting pieces of driftwood that had washed ashore. He found beauty in their wear, the smoothness shaped by years of friction, the quiet endurance of things battered but unbroken. Sometimes he wondered if that was what truth did to people, to soften them, reshape them, strip them down to something essential. He'd think of Lucy then, her steady eyes, her unflinching honesty, the way she carried pain like a torch rather than a wound. One afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning, wind howling across the bay and rain slicing through the air like threads of glass. Grant secured the shutters and stood by the window watching the water churn. The storm felt like a conversation between heaven and the sea, violent but necessary. When it passed, the world outside was transformed, the air clean, the sand gleaming, and the sky clear enough to show the faint trace of a rainbow stretching across the cove. It was then that he noticed something caught among the rocks, a small piece of paper pressed flat and darkened by seawater. He waded through the surf to reach it, his shoes sinking into wet sand. It wasn't a letter, just a fragment of newspaper torn and softened by the tide. The headline, barely legible, "Local Restaurateur Expands Community Kitchen Program." Beneath it was a photograph Lucy, standing beside a group of volunteers, apron tied around her waist, smile quiet but luminous. The article mentioned her name, her restaurant, and a project to serve free meals to families struggling through the winter. Grant folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his pocket, a faint smile touching his lips. Even far away, she was still building something that mattered. That night he wrote her a letter by hand, his first in years. The words came slowly at first, but then flowed with a clarity that surprised him. "Lucy, the sea here changes color every hour, as if it's trying to forget itself and begin again. I think that's what truth does. It doesn't erase the past. It reshapes it into something bearable. I see your name in the papers. You're doing what I should have done long ago, feeding something that isn't hunger for power. I hope the world is kind to you. If it isn't, come north. There's a place here where the waves keep their promises." Gee, he didn't send it. The act of writing was enough. It was a small confession to the universe, a way of setting something free. Winter arrived early along the coast, bringing long nights and the scent of pine smoke. Grant began hosting small dinners at his cabin, cooking for the handful of fishermen and locals who lived nearby. They spoke little, laughed easily, and never asked questions about who he had been. They only knew him as Grant, the man who made strong coffee and fixed leaky roofs and listened when others spoke. In those quiet gatherings, he discovered a new kind of wealth, the ordinary generosity of strangers who didn't want anything from him. One evening, near Christmas, he heard a knock on the door. When he opened it, Lucy stood there, cheeks flushed from the cold, snowflakes tangled in her hair. She was holding a tin of pastries and a letter folded neatly in her hand. "You didn't send this," she said softly, holding it up, "but the post office did." He blinked, startled, realizing he must have left it at the village store with his other papers. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he admitted. Lucy smiled faintly, stepping inside, her breath forming small clouds in the warm air. "You invited me north," she said, "and I wanted to see if the sea really keeps its promises." They sat by the fire, the crackling logs filling the silence between them. He poured tea, and she looked around at the simple room, the shelves lined with books, the maps pinned above the desk, the quiet order of a life rebuilt. "You look different," she said after a while, "like someone who finally stopped running." "I think I did," he answered, "and you look like someone who finally found where she belongs." She shrugged gently. "Maybe, but belonging isn't a place. It's people. It's truth." He nodded, understanding more than words could express. Outside, the wind softened, snow falling in slow, deliberate spirals that brushed against the window like feathers. Lucy placed the tin on the table, then reached into her coat and took out something small wrapped in cloth. "I brought this for you," she said. "It was my mother's." He unfolded the cloth carefully, revealing the second half of the photograph, the missing piece that completed the image he had kept in his drawer. The woman's arms now held the full figure of the child, smiling toward the camera. Together, they looked almost whole again. Grant's throat tightened. "You kept it all this time?" Lucy nodded. "Some things aren't meant to be thrown away. They're meant to remind us how far we've come." The firelight flickered between them, and in that fragile glow, everything unsaid found its place. Two people, shaped by loss, joined not by blood but by truth, sitting at the edge of the world where the ocean met forgiveness. The storm had passed, the air smelled of salt and smoke, and the night, for once, held nothing that needed hiding. The snow outside deepened overnight, muting the sound of the sea until it became a soft, endless whisper beneath the wind. Grant woke early, the cabin quiet except for the faint crackle of cooling embers and the rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Lucy was still asleep on the small couch near the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket, her face turned toward the light leaking through the window. For a moment, he simply watched her, realizing that peace didn't always arrive with triumph. It sometimes came disguised as stillness, fragile and fleeting, like the breath that fogged the glass before vanishing. He made coffee, careful not to wake her, then stood by the window with the mug warming his hands. The horizon was a watercolor of pale gold and gray, the tide sliding in slow and steady, reshaping the sand the way time reshapes memory. He thought about the years he had spent believing that control was safety, that truth was optional, and that money could protect a man from the ghosts of his own making. Yet here, stripped of everything that once defined him, he finally understood how wrong he had been. The silence that once terrified him now felt like a mercy. Lucy stirred behind him, stretching, blinking into the morning light. "You're awake early," she murmured, voice soft and rough with sleep. "I couldn't," he said, turning toward her with a faint smile. "I kept thinking about what you said, that belonging isn't a place, it's people." He paused, looking down at the photograph on the table, the one they had pieced together the night before. "I think she would have wanted this," he added, his tone quiet but certain. Lucy joined him by the window, her eyes tracing the line of the shore. "Maybe she just wanted us to finish what she started," she said, "to build something honest." Her reflection flickered faintly in the glass beside his, two shapes blending into the light. Before Grant could answer, a sharp knock broke the calm. He frowned, setting down his mug, and opened the door to find a courier standing in the snow, holding a thick envelope sealed with a familiar crest, the Caldwell family's. "Urgent," the man said, before turning back toward the road. Grant broke the seal, his pulse quickening despite himself. Inside was a letter from Charles Caldwell's legal team, written in the clipped precision of corporate vengeance. The board was suing him for breach of fiduciary duty, claiming his actions had caused financial loss and reputational damage. At the bottom, Charles's personal note scrawled in pen, "You chose truth. Let's see if it saves you now." Lucy watched his expression tighten as he read, "What is it?" He handed her the letter, his jaw set but calm. "It's the cost," he said simply. "They want what's left." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire had burned down to quiet embers, their light flickering weakly against the storm-gray morning. Then Lucy folded the letter and placed it back on the table. "Are you going to fight them?" she asked. Grant's answer came after a pause. "No," he said finally. "I've spent my whole life fighting for things that don't matter. Maybe it's time to lose something on purpose." She studied him, eyes searching. "That's not surrender," she said softly. "That's choosing peace." "Ah." He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You make it sound noble." "It is," she replied. "Because you're not running this time. You're standing still." The rest of the day passed in quiet tasks. Lucy helped him repair a broken window hinge while snow thickened outside, the wind rising in long, melodic gusts. They spoke little, but the silence between them was warm, threaded with unspoken understanding. At dusk, when the storm cleared and the first stars pierced the clouds, Grant lit the fireplace again and sat across from her, the flames painting both their faces in amber light. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "why people hide the truth when it's the only thing that can save them?" Lucy tilted her head, considering. "Because truth breaks before it heals," she said, "and most people can't stand the breaking." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "Maybe that's what my father feared most, the breaking." "Maybe," she said, but he still tried to make it right, even if it took a lifetime. The fire popped softly, sending tiny sparks into the air. Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes distant. "I don't know if redemption is real," he admitted. "Maybe it's just another word we use to make forgiveness sound easier." Lucy smiled faintly, her gaze steady. "Redemption isn't about being forgiven," she said. "It's about finally understanding what you did and choosing to live differently anyway." He looked at her, realizing that somewhere along the way her voice had become the compass he never knew he needed. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Have you found yours?" Her answer was simple but sure. "I think I did, when I stopped needing apologies to believe in change." The words hung between them, neither sharp nor soft, just true. The wind had died completely, leaving only the sound of waves against the rocks. Grant stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the moonlit water. "You were right," he said, his voice a near whisper. "The sea does keep its promises." Lucy joined him, the two of them standing side by side, reflected in the glass like echoes of another life. "It does," she said, "but only for those brave enough to listen." "Oh." He turned toward her then, the quiet gratitude in his eyes saying what words could not. Outside, the world was white and still, the stars sharp against the dark, the ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Inside, the air held the warmth of a fire that refused to fade, a promise that some truths, once spoken, never truly die. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the calm of a man no longer afraid of silence. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it as who we are, not who they wanted us to be." Lucy reached for his hand, her fingers curling gently around his. "Then that's the truth worth keeping," she whispered. The flames danced higher, shadows moving softly across the walls, and the cabin seemed to breathe with them alive, forgiving, waiting for morning. Morning arrived quietly, as if the world itself was reluctant to wake. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a landscape washed clean white fields stretching to the edge of the sea. The trees bowed under their own stillness. Grant rose early, the cabin cold enough for his breath to show, and stoked the fire back to life before making coffee. The letter from the Caldwell lawyers still lay unopened on the table where Lucy had left it the night before. He didn't need to read it again. Its threats were already burned into memory. Yet something about the morning felt different, lighter, resolved as though the long shadow of that name had finally reached its end. He stepped outside, mug in hand, the air biting against his skin, sharp and pure. The sea below the cliff moved with slow confidence, every wave rolling in deliberate rhythm, unbothered by human complications. Grant watched the tide creep closer, dissolving the line where sand met snow, and realized how easily boundaries disappeared when nature decided to reclaim them. Maybe that was the truth Helen Ward had always understood. Everything built on pretense eventually returns to the elements. By the time he went back inside, Lucy was awake, her hair loosely tied, her eyes still heavy with sleep but clear. She greeted him with a small smile, the kind that said more than words could carry. "You're up early again," she murmured. "Thinking?" "Always," he said, handing her a cup. "But this morning feels different, like something's ending." Lucy sipped the coffee, studying him for a long moment. "Maybe it's not an ending," she said quietly. "Maybe it's just the moment before you decide who you want to be." Grant nodded slowly, her words settling like snow on still water. "I've spent months undoing the man my father raised," he said. "But maybe it's time to stop tearing things down and start building again." Her smile deepened slightly. "Then start small," she said. "Start with something real." He took that to heart. After breakfast, he drove into the nearby town, a small harbor village where people still greeted strangers as if they were expected. The main street was lined with fishermen's cottages, a post office, and a shuttered boathouse that looked like it hadn't seen use in years. Grant stopped there, noticing a faded sign above the door that read Ashford Shipping Est, 1971, his father's first company, the one he had abandoned once the tech empire took off. The building was quiet, but the bones were good. Sturdy timber, high ceilings, and a view of the water wide enough to hold possibility. Grant called the number on the for sale notice pinned to the door, and by afternoon the place was his. When Lucy arrived that evening, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold she found him inside, sweeping dust and cobwebs into piles. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing softly. "Starting small," he said, echoing her words. "This place used to be my father's dream before it became his pride. I think it deserves another chance." She looked around, eyes moving over the rough planks and beams, catching the last light of dusk. "What will it be?" He shrugged, smiling faintly. "Maybe a workshop. Maybe a community space. Maybe a place where stories like ours can be told and believed." Something flickered in her gaze, then pride maybe, or quiet relief. "You're not running anymore," she said. "No," he answered, "and I don't plan to." They worked side by side through the evening, clearing the debris, patching windows, laughing when the wind pushed through the cracks. By the time night fell, the space had transformed. Not perfect, but alive, the scent of sawdust and ocean air mingling into something hopeful. They sat on the floor, backs against the wall, watching the tide glitter under the moonlight. "This is what she wanted," Lucy said after a long silence. "Not money or apologies, just to see something good rise from everything that fell apart." Grant nodded, looking out at the dark water. "I think she'd be proud of you," he said. "Of us," Lucy corrected gently. The quiet stretched again, comfortable and steady. Grant turned the folded photograph over in his hands, the one they had pieced together, now framed simply in wood. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "But I don't try to control it anymore. I just show up and tell the truth." He smiled, his gaze drifting to her face illuminated by the moonlight through the window. "You make that sound so easy." "It's not," she replied, "but it's simple. Outside, the tide reached its highest point, brushing the edges of the old dock with quiet insistence. It reminded Grant of time, how it always moved forward, washing away the old without asking permission. He realized that tomorrow, when the lawyers called or the papers demanded statements, he would answer with the same clarity that now filled the room. No rehearsed lines, no denials, just truth. The kind that didn't need to defend itself. Lucy leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half closed. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" she asked. Grant laughed softly. "That depends. Before or after I accused you of blackmail?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "Before," she said. "You said, 'Who told you to bring this?'" He groaned at the memory. "I was an idiot." "No," she said gently. "You were afraid. There's a difference." Grant looked at her, realizing how far they'd both come from that moment. The restaurant, the chandelier, the folded note trembling between two strangers divided by class and guilt. Everything had changed since then, except for the truth that began it. And maybe that was the point. When they finally stepped outside, the cold wrapped around them like glass. The stars were bright, scattered across the black sky in impossible abundance. Lucy took his arm as they walked toward the pier, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. The wind smelled of salt and cedar, and something new. "Tomorrow," Grant said quietly, "I'll call the lawyers and let them take what they want. I won't fight anymore." Lucy nodded. "That's not giving up," she said. "That's choosing what deserves your strength." They reached the edge of the pier, waves glimmering beneath them, the sound of the sea slow and patient. Grant turned to her, voice low but certain. "When this is over, I want to build something here with you. Something that doesn't need to be hidden." Lucy didn't answer right away, but her hand tightened around his. "Then build it," she said softly. "I'll be here." The night closed gently around them, the ocean breathing beneath their feet, and for the first time in years, Grant felt that the silence no longer demanded confession, it offered grace. The truth, at last, had stopped tearing things apart and begun stitching them back together. The next morning broke under a pale sky, the kind of soft light that makes everything appear suspended between endings and beginnings. Grant woke before the sun had fully risen, the world outside his window shimmering with frost, the surface of the sea still and glass-like. For a few seconds, he stayed in bed, listening to the rhythmic hum of waves against the pier and the occasional creak of wood as the house adjusted to the cold. Then came the sound of Lucy in the kitchen, the quiet clink of cups, the familiar smell of coffee weaving through the air, small reminders that life, however fragile, continues. When he stepped into the kitchen, she was standing by the counter, hair tied loosely, sweater hanging off one shoulder, a picture of unstudied calm. "You didn't sleep," she said, handing him a mug. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "I kept thinking about today." Her eyes softened. "You don't have to face them alone." "I do," he said, but there was no defiance in his tone, only certainty. "Some things you fix yourself, not because you have to, but because you finally can." By mid-morning, the call came. The board had reached a settlement. The Caldwell family would withdraw their lawsuit in exchange for his complete resignation and public acknowledgement of fault. It was, by every definition, a loss, but one that brought relief rather than defeat. Grant listened to the lawyer's words without anger, then signed the agreement in silence. When it was over, he turned off his phone and placed it on the counter beside the old photograph. The weight he had carried for decades lifted with surprising ease, leaving behind not emptiness but clarity. Lucy found him sitting on the steps outside, staring at the sea. "Is it done?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "It's done. Everything they built around my name, it's gone." She lowered herself beside him, pulling her knees close to her chest. "Maybe that's what freedom looks like," she said. "Not gain, but release." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You always make ruin sound holy." The afternoon drifted by quietly, the two of them working side by side at the boathouse, brushing fresh paint onto the wooden walls, the smell of salt and turpentine blending in the cool air. The village children wandered by, curious about the transformation. Grant handed them brushes, letting them paint the lower boards, laughing as streaks of white and blue splattered across his boots. Lucy watched him, arms crossed, her smile small but genuine. He looked younger, then unburdened, ordinary, beautifully human. As dusk approached, they hung the new sign above the entrance. The Haven. No surname, no emblem, no legacy, just a name simple enough to hold any story. It would serve as a workshop for the locals, a place for repairing boats, sharing meals, and teaching children to read the currents of the tide. "It's perfect," Lucy said quietly, stepping back to admire it. "You've built something that finally belongs to no one and everyone." Grant looked at her, the reflection of sunset catching in his eyes. "We built it," he corrected gently. Later, when the first lanterns flickered to life along the pier, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, leaving behind only the sound of water and laughter fading into distance. Grant and Lucy remained, sitting on the dock's edge, their feet dangling above the darkening sea. The air smelled of pine and salt, and the horizon burned with the last light of day. "I used to think redemption meant undoing the past," Grant said after a long pause. "But now I think it's just learning to live without lying to yourself." Lucy glanced at him, her expression unreadable but kind. "Maybe it's both," she said. "You had to break the lie before you could build the truth." He nodded, his gaze on the endless water. "Do you ever regret giving me that note?" She shook her head, smiling softly. "Not once. It wasn't meant to destroy you. It was meant to wake you up." And the wind picked up slightly, carrying the sound of waves slapping against the dock's pillars. Grant closed his eyes, letting the rhythm settle into him. "You know," he said quietly, "I think my father was trying to tell me the same thing all along. He just didn't know how." Lucy reached over, covering his hand with hers. "Some people speak truth too late," she said. "You didn't." "Oh." The last of the light slipped below the horizon, leaving only the soft glow of lanterns and the moon's pale reflection on the water. For the first time, Grant didn't feel haunted by what he had lost, only grateful for what remained. The world, stripped of noise and pretense, felt astonishingly wide. He turned toward Lucy, his voice low but steady. "Whatever happens next, it doesn't have to be written by anyone else." She smiled, leaning her head lightly against his shoulder. "Then, let's write it slowly," she whispered. They sat that way until the cold began to settle in, the stars thick above them, the boathouse glowing softly behind. Grant looked once more at the sign swinging gently in the wind and realized that for all the empires he had inherited and lost, this, the quiet companionship, the honest air, the peace earned through truth, was the only kingdom that mattered. When they finally stood to leave, he paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the sea. "You were right," he said, voice soft, almost to himself. "Freedom isn't about escaping the past, it's about not letting it own you." Lucy reached for the door, holding it open as the lantern light spilled across the snow. "Then you're free," she said simply. He followed her inside, the warmth of the fire meeting them like an embrace, the sound of the ocean fading into a lullaby. Outside, the tide began its slow retreat, whispering against the shore, a reminder that even the heaviest waves eventually find their way home. Winter passed slowly, carving the coastline into sharper edges and turning the mornings into long silences filled with frost and distant gulls. By the time the snow began to soften, the haven had already become more than a building. It was a living heartbeat in the small town. Fishermen came to repair their nets in its wide, open hall. Children learned to sand wood and tie ropes. Old men played cards by the window while Lucy brewed coffee strong enough to wake the sea. It wasn't grand, but it was good, humble, sturdy, human. Grant found himself waking each day before dawn, lighting the stove, and standing for a moment in the doorway to breathe the salt air before anyone arrived. There was something sacred about that hour, when the world still belonged to quiet people who kept their promises. News of his fall from power had long since burned out in the cities. The magazines that once printed his name had already moved on to newer scandals, younger billionaires, and brighter illusions. The silence that followed wasn't punishment, it was peace. Grant no longer feared the absence of headlines. He wore it like a cloak. Sometimes, when the mail arrived with more legal notices or offers from publishers hungry for confession, he simply fed the envelopes to the stove without opening them. The truth, he realized, didn't need to be sold to be real. It just needed to be lived. Lucy thrived in the rhythm of the place. She taught anyone who asked how to mend sails, how to listen for the change in wind before a storm, how to fix a broken hinge with patience instead of force. People began calling her Miss Lucy, not because she demanded respect, but because she earned it without trying. When the local paper came to write about the community center, the reporter described her as the soul of the harbor. Grant kept a copy of that issue folded in his desk drawer. He never mentioned it to her, but sometimes, when the nights were too long, he reread the article just to remind himself that goodness could grow quietly and still change everything. On the first clear evening of spring, they hosted a small gathering to celebrate the center's official reopening. Lanterns hung from ropes above the dock, their reflections rippling in the dark water. The townspeople brought food pies, fish chowder, bread still warm from the oven, and laughter filled the air. Grant stood at the edge of the pier, watching the light spread over the water like spilled gold. Lucy joined him, carrying 2 mugs of cider, her cheeks glowing from the lantern light. "You look proud," she teased gently. "I'm grateful," he said. "That's better." She smiled, leaning on the railing beside him. "Do you ever miss it? The money? The noise? The pretending?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I miss my ignorance sometimes, though. It was easier not to know how fragile everything was." Lucy's gaze softened. "Maybe, but you wouldn't trade it back." "No," he said, after a pause. "Not for anything." The music behind them swelled a fiddle, and an old accordion filling the air with something joyful and unfinished. A child's laughter cut through the song, and for a moment Grant felt time blur, the years folding into each other. The ghosts of his past didn't haunt him anymore. They stood quietly among the crowd, nodding their approval. He thought of his father, of Helen, of the note that had started it all, and realized how strange redemption truly was. It never arrived with fanfare, only with the gentlest of recognitions, that one had survived, and maybe even learned how to love rightly. When the guests began to leave, Lucy stayed behind to help him gather the empty dishes. The sea had gone still, the lanterns now dimming one by one. "You should rest," she said. "You've worked enough for 3 men today." He laughed softly. "Work feels different now. It doesn't drain me anymore. It feeds me." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then keep feeding it. The world needs men who build quietly." As they walked back toward the cabin, the stars came out one by one, scattered and fragile, like truths finally spoken aloud. Grant stopped halfway up the path and looked back at the haven, its windows glowing warm against the cold. "It feels alive," he said. "It is," Lucy answered. "It's what happens when something is built on honesty instead of ambition." At the cabin, they found a letter waiting on the step, the envelope weathered from travel. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned but unmistakably familiar. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, and carried the weight of memory. "You did what I couldn't. You told the truth and survived it. For that, you have my respect." There was no name, but they both knew whose hand had written it: Charles Caldwell. Grant folded the letter carefully, then placed it into the fire. The flames took it quickly, curling the paper into smoke. "Maybe that's his way of saying goodbye," Lucy said. Grant watched the ashes rise, his expression unreadable but calm. Then let him have peace too. They stood by the fire until only embers remained, the faint glow reflecting in their eyes. Outside, the tide was turning, the soft roar of waves filling the quiet like a lullaby. Lucy reached for his hand, and he let her hold it, the warmth grounding them both. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "I used to think redemption was a finish line," he said. "But maybe it's just the moment you stop needing to prove you've changed." Lucy's answer came softly. Maybe it's the moment you finally start living like it. The last embers flared once before collapsing into ash. They stood in the fading warmth, two silhouettes framed against the dark sea, the world vast and merciful around them. Tomorrow would bring work and tide and the same quiet routine, but tonight there was nothing left to fear. The past had been spoken, the truth had done its work, and somewhere deep beneath the steady rhythm of waves, forgiveness moved like light, slow, patient, and infinite. Spring settled fully along the coast, painting the harbor in soft tones of salt blue and gold. Each morning arrived with the hush of gulls and the hum of the sea against the pier, and the haven breathed quietly in rhythm with the tide. Grant walked there alone at dawn, hands tucked in his coat pockets, the cold wind pressing against him but never cruel. The building stood open, its windows catching the light, the scent of coffee already spilling into the air from the small kitchen Lucy had insisted on building. It was still early, but he could hear voices inside: the fishermen, the children, the quiet laughter of people who no longer saw him as a billionaire or a scandal, but simply as Grant, the man who kept the fire lit. He stepped through the doorway and paused at the old notice board near the entrance. Someone had pinned a new sheet of paper there overnight, the edges curling from the damp. In thick, looping handwriting it read, "A promise means nothing unless it's kept." Beneath the words was a faded photograph, Helen standing in front of the same pier, smiling in the sunlight, the sea blazing behind her. For a moment his throat tightened. He didn't know who had left it, but he didn't need to. The universe had a way of returning things when they were finally understood. Lucy entered a few minutes later, brushing hair from her face, her hands already dusted with flour. "You're here early," she said, noticing the way his eyes lingered on the note. "I wanted to see the light come in," he replied. "It changes everything." She smiled faintly. "It always has." They moved through the morning together, preparing for another busy day. Grant fixed a hinge on the back door while Lucy kneaded dough, humming under her breath. The air smelled of yeast and ocean, warm and familiar. When the first villagers arrived, bringing baskets of tools and chatter, the building filled again with motion saws cutting through wood, laughter bouncing off the beams, the low thrum of community being rebuilt one gesture at a time. Later, when the sun climbed high and the work paused for lunch, Grant stepped outside and sat on the edge of the dock. The sea stretched wide before him, its surface alive with silver light. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the ruins of everything he once believed mattered. Here, within reach, was everything that actually did. He thought of Helen, of his father, of Lucy's mother's letter, and realized how quietly truth had remade them all, not through vengeance or apology, but through the slow, steady work of understanding. Lucy joined him, carrying 2 bowls of soup, sitting beside him without a word. For a while they just ate, listening to the water lap against the pilings. Finally she spoke. "Do you ever wonder what she'd say if she saw all this?" Grant smiled faintly, watching a gull skim across the surface of the waves. "I think she'd say we kept our promise," he said. Lucy nodded, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. "Then that's enough." The afternoon unfolded gently, sunlight spilling through the windows like grace. Children ran along the dock, chasing one another's shadows, and old men leaned back in chairs to watch them, content in the rhythm of small joys. Inside, the framed photograph of Helen caught the last beam of light, the glass glowing softly, as if her smile were part of the air itself. When the day finally faded and the tide began to rise again, Grant turned off the lamps and stood by the open door. The sea glittered under the first stars, endless and forgiving. He could feel Lucy's presence behind him, steady and sure, and in that stillness he understood that nothing more needed to be said. Some stories didn't end with grand gestures, they ended like this, with the quiet proof that life goes on. He reached up and smoothed the edges of the paper on the notice board one last time, his fingers brushing over the familiar words. "A promise means nothing unless it's kept." Outside, the waves answered softly, rolling toward shore and breaking in slow applause. The night folded around the harbor, calm and luminous, and the haven stood glowing in the dark, a single light that had outlasted every storm.